Okay, hi everyone. I'm Carrie Cordero. Welcome to this afternoon session on national security reporting. I'm delighted that you are with us here this afternoon, and also to our virtual viewers. I am joined today by a terrific panel of experts in the world of national security reporting and national security media editing and analysis. And so let me introduce to you who I've got with me today, and then we will dive into a conversation to talk about what it's like to be a national security reporter and leading a website in national security reporting and analysis in today's current environment, where we have ongoing conflicts all around the world and a very interesting and dynamic political environment. So joining me here first is Alex Marquardt, who, as some of you know, is also my colleague at CNN, where he is the chief national security correspondent. Alex has extensive experience reporting all around the world. In particular, he was in Ukraine when Russia invaded in February of 2022. Prior to being with CNN, he was with ABC News, and he was based all around the world in Moscow, Jerusalem, Beirut, and London. I'm so grateful that Alex Marquardt is here with us today to share his extensive experience reporting on national security issues all around the world. Also delighted to have with us another Alex Ward, who is a national security reporter covering the White House and State Department for the Wall Street Journal. Alex's reporting, in particular, he's focused on all of the major national security issues that are going on today, as well as into the inner workings of how the National Security Council and the other institutions that do our national security policy making work. He also has a book that came out last year, which is The Internationalists: The Fight to Restore American Foreign Policy After Trump. And so, Alex Ward, we're looking forward to hearing your insights. I'm also joined by my fellow lawyer and media person who's engaged in media. Natalie Orpett is the executive editor of Lawfare, which is very familiar to many of us in the policy audience here in Washington. Lawfare is a multimedia platform, and so Natalie works to edit that, which includes both some independent reporting and then also a lot of commentary and analysis, bringing sort of making sense of all of the policy goings on in DC and around the world. So really grateful to have different types of media represented here today, and a wide array of experience. I wanted our session to focus on, make sure that our conference included something on national security reporting and the work that journalists are doing. In particular, because those of us in Washington who are in the policy space, you know, we often pride ourselves on having kind of the inside scoop to things and being in the know and talking to folks in government. But oftentimes, people in government, those of us outside of government, we learn what's going on from the actual reporting. And so the work that all of you do is so essential to informing the policy debate, informing the outside audiences, and of course, informing the public. A few things that I'm hoping that we get to in our conversation today is we're going to start with the ongoing crises, two wars ongoing, which have been themes throughout the day, both in Ukraine and in Israel and Gaza. What it's like to cover national security in this current environment. And I'm also interested in your thoughts for how you envision your current role as national security reporters, journalists, and those working in the national security information space, I guess I'll call it. So, Alex Marquardt, let me start with you. As we've mentioned, you have served overseas, you have been in conflict zones dating back over a decade, but also quite intensively in the Ukraine war. Can you just talk to us generally about what has it been like being a journalist in this most recent period of years with these conflicts when the resolution of them is so uncertain?
Yeah, and being a policy reporter in Washington, you gain so much by going to these places, and it is a completely different kind of job where you're going to, say, the front lines in Ukraine and you're talking to the regular soldiers or the regular people in those towns and villages versus when you're back here in Washington and talking to policymakers. And those trips out there into the field really, really do benefit you back here. There's been a real evolution, I think, of the way that we have covered Ukraine in that it was so intense in the beginning, and of course now more than 3 years on, it has, I'm not going to say petered out, but there's far less attention to it unless there are big things that are happening. I think the last few months of these negotiations, or at least the attempts by the Trump administration to get these negotiations up and running, have really put the spotlight obviously back on Ukraine, back on the Russians, and we at CNN have had a pretty consistent presence in Kyiv throughout the past few months. But there was a moment a couple years ago, I can't remember exactly when it was, when we went from certainly the TV news press went from consistent, nonstop, always covered presence in Kyiv to sort of going in on an ad hoc basis. So much of what I'm doing now is trying to figure out where these conversations are going. And that means, of course, talking to as many people in the Trump orbit who are focused on this, talking to the Ukrainians. The Russians are a little bit harder to crack, and of course there are other parties who are involved in this as well. But it is, without question, an extraordinarily dangerous conflict to cover. The weaponry that the Russians are firing into Ukraine is considerable, to say the least. The last time I was in Ukraine, I was in Odessa for most of it. This was when the grain deal fell apart. The Ukrainians had just attacked the Kerch Bridge, which connects Russia to Crimea, and the Russians were coming into Crimea into Odessa with everything they had: Shahed drones flying low over the hotel, hypersonic missiles, all different kinds of missiles coming in. So it's extremely dangerous. I have so much admiration for our colleagues, other journalists who are doing that kind of work, both Ukrainian and foreign, and then of course the Ukrainian civilians themselves who are facing this unjust war. It's been an extraordinary story to cover, and just watching the way that these conversations, discussions about a potential ceasefire, we're not even talking about a peace deal, but a ceasefire have unfolded. I don't have much hope that that's going to happen anytime soon.
Thank you for those insights. Alex Ward, let me ask you, Alex Marquardt was talking about the fact that sort of the news coverage ebbs and flows, right? And so when there's an initial invasion, it's sort of all the media attention is geared towards that. But currently, and I think sort of the various topics that we've been talking about today here at the conference, there are so many different national security issues. So the trade issues and the tariffs is sort of can suck the oxygen out of covering what is this ongoing war. Also have the war going on in Israel and Gaza. How do you, from your national security journalism lens, how do you manage that broad array of issues and try to figure out what do I need to be focusing on to get out to my audience?
Well, the first thing is that one of the earliest insights I had when I got into this kind of reporting was we do foreign policy, we don't do foreign affairs. And I think that just kind of goes for pretty much all U.S. media. If that were the case, if we were covering foreign affairs, Sudan would be a much bigger story, for example, or a bunch of other things happening in the world. So we cover foreign policy. So that helps me narrow it down. I've got to focus on things, and my colleagues have to focus on things that President Trump's going to be talking about with his colleagues, that our allies are going to be caring about what our decisions are. And so then I go, okay, so that means I got to focus on Ukraine, I got to focus on Israel, Gaza, I got to focus on tariffs, and that's kind of it. Where like Biden, you would think, okay, you got to think about Ukraine, of course, you got to think about Gaza, maybe climate change type stuff. You've got to think about the investments they're doing in AI, and so it changes with every administration, and that's because of their policies. Now,
so does that? Can I just interrupt you for a second? So does that account for the fact? I think one of my colleagues was mentioning earlier. There was a flare-up in India, Pakistan recently, and yet other things tend to dominate the coverage. Is that sort of an example of
Right. I mean,
what's the U.S. policy angle to that?
Yeah, I mean,
from a news perspective?
You know, if Trump had named some sort of India-Pakistan envoy and we were really there to solve all the kinds of issues that are going on between India and Pakistan, yeah, it would get more coverage. But because Trump kind of said, we did it, we solved it, there's no more nuclear crisis ever between those two countries, then we kind of can go back to what you know, is really sort of dominating every day, which is right now, and to the point sort of Alex was making, I mean, when we're talking about the Ukraine-Russia war right now, the main stuff is about, is Trump going to sanction the Russians again, or, you know, add sanctions? Is he going to send more weaponry to Ukraine, or what actually happens if the U.S. doesn't send more weaponry to Ukraine? These are the sorts of policy questions we're having now. It's different than, especially those initial days in which we were trying to figure out where are the troops, what weapons are being sent. You know, is Putin going to relent at some point, or what is his actual objective? Can the Ukrainians hold? And of course, stories move naturally, but we've really moved to sort of a policy space. And to your main question of prioritization, you know, there's a whole world to cover and a billion things to cover. But at least I think our charge is we have a foreign policy world to cover, and foreign affairs we kind of leave it to others.
Okay, all right, so we've got CNN, we've got Wall Street Journal, all household names. Natalie is the editor of Lawfare, might be a household name in this room, but might not necessarily be a household name all across America and the world. So can you tell me from your perspective, Natalie, as you're looking at the landscape of the issues that you guys cover to inform your audience, like how do you narrow down what it is that you want to focus on and that you think is important for your particular audience?
Yeah, so we are primarily focused on the intersection, the nexus of law and policy in the national security space. So a lot of what we do is responsive to what's going on in the news. And so we rely very heavily on people like Alex and Alex. And a lot of it is sort of anticipatory. So for example, when there were early discussions about whether a response to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine should be the American or even European Union seizure of Russian assets, either as a sanction or even as a means of providing aid to Ukraine, we did a deep dive into whether that was lawful, whether that was a feasible option, or whether it was just sort of a policy proposal one-off. We also did things that were more responsive in the vein of explaining exactly how the aid package that Congress had just passed for supporting Ukraine would actually roll out, what would it look like, what were the legal authorities around it. So our charge is really to provide a oftentimes more technical and usually much more in-depth coverage of what's going on, but with a heavy focus on what is timely. So we're able to produce, or at least we aim to produce, really academic level rigor, but the day after something happens, to help inform journalists, to help inform policymakers, to help inform academics about how to think of these things. And so that can range from highly technical, but it can also be sort of explainer pieces. So for instance, when the discussion of what was going on in Israel's response to Hamas's attack on October 7th, we did some basic explainer of, you know, there are these terms going around that are part of international humanitarian law, and here's what they actually mean. You know, some people might respond that that's irrelevant to what's important about understanding this conflict, but our view is that the law really matters and it's important to understand, and it's important for an audience to be able to understand as well. So we did things like explain, you know, proportionality has a meaning under international humanitarian law that is not at all the same thing as proportionality in the layman's sense.
So Alex Marquardt, so much of the work that you and your colleagues do requires access in some way. Again, going back, let's sort of first talk about the international side of things, and then we'll come back to what here in the US. But on the international side, when you're covering these types of conflicts, What has been the environment over the last few years, and we can talk about Ukraine, and then also, I know this is a particular issue in the Gaza war, but when you are an American journalist covering a war abroad where America has interests, America has influence, America is providing support, but it's not an American war, it's a foreign war. How does the host government, what is your experience in terms of the access that you've been able to have and how that influences what you're able to report out?
It's conflict by conflict, and I do think it's important to get to Israel-Gaza in a second, because that is very black and white, and that is just an extraordinary case of journalists being completely cut out of one of the biggest stories in the world. But it's going to depend on the government, and there's going to be an evolution. I mean, the Ukrainians have really changed over time. They've definitely restricted access to the front lines, access to different units. They're very, very particular about who you're talking to and how you're talking to them. There is a level of, and I don't say this lightly, there's a level of paranoia that I've seen in Ukraine that I haven't really seen in other conflicts, in terms of identifying or potentially identifying where you are. I was out doing a story on some soldiers testing a new drone, and they were very, very particular about how we shot the different angles, because they thought that if we got certain towers and trees, that the Russians would be able to geolocate this position outside Kyiv, which was not a very sensitive position. Someone else I interviewed about a drone wanted their voice changed and only shot from the back, because he thought that even if it was his normal voice, the Russians would be able to figure out who he was and come after him and his family. So there's a lot of fear. I think some of it justified, some of it not necessarily justified. And I've had at times a difficult relationship with the Ukrainians in terms of the access. One of the times I got there was when I had just arrived when President Biden visited. And that was kept under, that was very, very tightly held until the last minute. And I think we had a bit of a heads up, just in terms of minutes. And I reported that as President Zelensky and President Biden walked across the square, that the air raid sirens went off, and that I hadn't heard that in the days that I'd already been in Kyiv. And that got picked up in the right-wing media here in the US, Tucker Carlson and others, who made it sound like the Ukrainians had staged this in order to really amp up the atmosphere while President Biden was there, and the Ukrainians were furious and threatened to kick me out of revoke my press pass and kick me out of the country. So those are just a couple examples of, they're obviously understandably trying to shape the narrative of the war. Now that's not to say that they're not allowing access, it's just you really do have to go through the formalities, and the same goes for the U.S. military. I mean, if you were doing embeds with the U.S. in Iraq or Afghanistan, it was the same thing. I didn't do a lot of Iraq and Afghanistan, but I think without question there's an overarching theme of it is getting much more dangerous for journalists to work in these war zones. There was a time, and I'm looking at my colleague Kim Dozier over there, who's done a lot of this coverage in the Middle East and elsewhere, and she'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I do think that there was a view that conflict journalists were neutral players in all this, and were kind of seen as not necessarily above the fray, but just not involved. And I think these days there's a total disregard for that kind of thing. And then the last thing I'll say is I just think that the fact that Israel has gotten away with blocking journalists from getting into this conflict for 20 months is just outrageous. Now, of course, Egypt shares a border with Gaza as well, but Egypt's not going to do anything unless Israel allows them to. So the fact that we've been covering this from the outside for 20 months is incredible, and I don't think we make a big enough deal out of it.
And so just to educate both our virtual audience and our in-person audience, so since October 7th and then the Israeli incursion into Gaza, there has been, correct me if I'm wrong, I think one CNN reporter who was allowed in by the Israeli government. Other media?
So Gaza, of course, surrounded on all sides by a wall and the sea, so you can't just walk in, of course. And there have been past conflicts. There was one in 08-09 that was short-lived, where Israel did the same thing, not allowing independent journalists in from the outside. I covered the wars in Gaza in 2012 and 2014 when they did allow us in, and of course we want to be on the ground. But journalists have only been allowed in with the IDF on IDF embeds, and of course it's great that you get to see it, but there's a big difference between being with the Israeli military and going in independently. Clarissa Ward, my colleague, went in December of 2023. She's the only one who has gone in independently. My thinking is that that didn't make Israel look very good, and that's why we have not seen anybody since then. In the meantime, Palestinian journalists have been doing absolutely heroic work in getting the word out, getting video out, getting sound out, and have been killed to the tune of some 200, I think, at the last count.
I want to shift the lens a little bit and direct it towards sort of the U.S. side and the access, so still the access to information and what that's like on the reporting side, but to shift it in terms of U.S. Politics, the current administration, how that compares to prior administrations. Alex Ward, I'm looking at you. No secret that there is a turnover in Trump administration national security positions, most prominently probably being in the national security advisor position. Talk to us, Alex Ward, as you are covering American foreign policy, how does the sort of shifting landscape of senior level officials, how has that affected your ability to accurately inform the public about national security issues?
No one knows anything? Like it's, and I'm saying that a little bit cheekily, but like it's not really, it's like 6 to 12 people who really know what's going on any major given subject. And Steve Witkoff.
I want to be 6 to 12 reporters or 6 to 12
6 to
people
12
in
Trump
the
administration officials, and 8 of them are Steve Witkoff.
So there you go. Okay.
It's like the West Wing, where the whole country is run by 6 people.
Right. I mean, it's all on WhatsApp or Signal, I guess. But like, it's what's kind of wild is, I mean, the NSC's been decimated. The Secretary of State is the National Security Advisor, but really he's also the National Archivist, so he's spending time looking for treasure maps.
Okay, wait. Let's just pause on that for a second. Okay, so Secretary Rubio is dual-hatted as the National Security Advisor. From your reporting, how does he divide his time?
He's at the White House. He's barely at Foggy Bottom. Christopher Landau, the Deputy Secretary, is basically the one who runs that building, which is traditionally kind of how it works anyway. But as far as I understand it, Rubio is.
So he really is serving as National Security Advisor.
He's the National Security Advisor, but he is dual-hatted. But like he's not in the building. He's not running that building as much as he would otherwise. So he's moved from sort of the outer circles of Trump world right into the center of it. And then you have the NSC underneath where senior directors have been wiped out. There are, of course, and then you've had detailees, a lot of them, about 100 plus, moved back to their agencies. So it's a small crew, it's a skeleton crew there at the White House without a full-fledged national security advisor, although Rubio's doing that job. You've got tons of assistant secretaries missing. You've got tons of, at state, you've got tons of high-level folks at DOD missing. And then you've got Witkoff, who's running 3, arguably 4 of the biggest foreign policy negotiations going out there. So like, again, it's like 6 to 12 people. And part of the reason they did this NSC shift was to make it, I mean, they've been open about this, to make it more top-down, not bottom-up, right? This is CNAS and this is a DC crowd, so we all have to talk about process. We all know how it works, right? It's supposed to start with multiple meetings that take forever, but eventually gets up to the president if the decision's big enough, and it could be 3 options and then the president chooses. Now, it is what the president says and everyone underneath makes it work. Granted, foreign policy is mostly these days the president's prerogative, but it's almost like he's not really he being Trump is not really getting tons of options. He's not really having the deliberations he normally would have. It's just he makes a call and then the bureaucracy goes and follows.
Okay, so the institutionalists in the room here would really talk about the value in the process, right? I used to work in a government agency long ago in my former life. Many in the room and many of my CNAS colleagues have as well. And so there can be value in the process. NSC had a very specific process in terms of coordinating the interagency. And so the theory behind that is that through interagency debate, coordination, informing, that then the best ideas would come up. And so what you're describing is just a different model.
For sure, and like it's not a knock necessarily on this team. I mean, the process has to serve the president, and in this case, it wasn't necessarily serving because, and this was kind of the same in the first term too, right? Trump would just kind of make a decision, everyone would follow. So they've cut a lot of needless meetings in their mind and just kind of cut to the heart of the matter, which is where's the president, what does he want to do, and we'll all just follow underneath. The pro and con. The pro for them is, again, it works for Trump's model and it can move things faster and there is a quality to speed. And the con is it could move things faster and it might not, the best ideas might not have risen to the top.
Natalie, how do you see this play out from your perspective in terms of the network that Lawfare would turn to inform the work that you do?
Yeah, well, one comment on that, the way that I would think about things with a sort of legal framework on things is it's not just that that's a policy theory for making good policy, it's also that that's what the law says. That's the legal structure, right? We have a system where cabinet secretaries have to come through advice and consent from the Senate, and those people are supposed to be involved in making policy. That's the system of separation of powers and the way that branches interact with each other that we've decided upon. So there is a sort of different perspective to bring to that as well. In terms of access, we are not primarily a reporting entity in the way that these guys are. We do some original reporting, and that tends to be, again, through sort of a legalistic lens, which is often things like having our contributors sit through an entire trial. We had coverage of the Proud Boys trial, of the Oath Keepers trial, of the various trials of President Trump's criminal indictments, and now several that we're following very closely relating to challenges of executive orders in the national security space. And that's in part because we have a different mandate. It's much more analytical, and in breaking news, it's often, or in reporting on things, it's often using the time and resources and space that we can dedicate to things to do deep dives into complicated issues and put things together, but also be able to convey things that you're really only going to get from being able to spend a tremendous number of hours deep into documents, deep into listening to a trial, understanding the bizarre procedural twists and turns. Separately from that, I think an interesting vantage point that we bring to things is we have sort of a network of experts in various areas, and many of them are located abroad. So we did have some, I would say sort of in between, and depending on the piece, some sort of more in the reporting category, some more in the analytical category. For example, we have a fellow right now who's located in Kyiv. She's a former journalist for the Kyiv Independent. So she's doing some sort of reporting work, much more analytical. We have several people who are Ukrainians working either there or elsewhere, reporting on Ukraine. We have several Israelis who have contributed to our site quite a lot, and so they're doing some very complicated work on some of the domestic legal framework, which is contributing very much to the access point that Alex was talking about, and what is available to the press based on changing rules domestically in Israel.
Now, having been, disclosure here, I get to work with Alex Marquardt in my outside capacity as an analyst with CNN, and I've had a long relationship with Lawfare as a contributing editor there. Over time, Lawfare has had sort of informal conversations and dialogue and been able to engage with people in government, not necessarily at like the senior NSC levels, but also just sort of civil service and people who are working in government. And in the many years that I've been familiar with the site's work, they were able to have those conversations, and those conversations that folks working for Lawfare were able to have with people in government would inform the work that then you're able to put out. I want to ask you, and then I want to come back around to both of you. How in the current environment are you finding the willingness of people in government to engage with you, or has that dynamic changed in some way?
Yeah, I mean, I think our network is a combination of former officials, people who are involved in the policy or lawmaking process in one respect or another, a lot of government lawyers. So we are able to get a lot of insight from people who are former officials, but then we do also still have quite a few contacts who are in government still. I think the primary difference is because we're not a reporting entity as much as we are an analysis entity. People are willing to talk to us to help us understand issues and policies as they're going on and what's really happening so that we can produce content that is useful to what's actually going on. But our mandate is not to sort of take quotes from them and publish a factual account of what they're saying or what's going on.
Alex Ward, let me ask you, how is that looking in terms of the willingness of individuals in government at various levels to help inform your reporting?
I mean, it's there, and I want to make clear that when I said earlier nobody knows anything, I was being cheeky about like just the fact that the information is a really tight circle, right? Because there just aren't a lot of these people. But people are willing to chat about the sort of debates that they're having, about the ideas that they have. That's kinds of people who are mattering, who's the internal, the palace intrigue. But when they talk to us about the ideas that they're discussing or policies that they hope to be executing, they're not always speaking for what's going to be the decision or that idea necessarily is in play, because that's that tight circle, right? So people are willing to chat, but I will say it is very different from obviously the Biden years, but even Trump 1. And Trump 1, even though again, that policy process was bottom up, but not really fully, people would still chat and they would have at least an idea of what was really in play. And even though there was a sort of a tight, a tight circle around leaks, there were still a bunch of people willing to chat, and the Trump 1 was notoriously leaky. Trump 2, much more disciplined, and much more policy disciplined. And part of that is because, again, things are coming almost directly from the president, but the other part of that is there's a lot more loyalty around this administration. There's a lot more team play. There isn't as many factions infighting, and so they're not trying to like jockey for position in the press. They are very mission oriented, and so they're still willing to talk to the press, but it's more about here's what we're doing, you report it accurately or don't, and sort of move on.
But to that point, I don't know how much they care as much about shaping that message, because there are obvious benefits to them engaging with us. Yes, you can put Caroline Leavitt up at the podium and she can give the president's position, the White House's position, even if it's on national security. But the NSC, even before the NSC just got dismantled, their NSC press team did not engage nearly on the same level as the Biden NSC press team or Trump 1 NSC press team. I mean, I'm the top national security reporter at CNN. I couldn't even get the NSC's press spokesman to return my calls or emails. They just didn't engage in the same kind of way. You remember John Kirby would have background or off-the-record calls all the time. The NSC would call up reporters to speak off the record and try to shape our reporting, or at least like really get inside what we're up to, what we're thinking all the time. And you would have press shops all across town, and again, this goes back to Trump 1 as well, that would engage with reporters. That doesn't happen anymore. You look at the Office of Director of National Intelligence, they barely respond. You look at the State Department, the spokeswoman does not give out her phone number to reporters, and it's not consistent across the board, because I do think the State Department right now, for example, is doing a much better job at engaging with reporters than, say, the Pentagon. which I think has had one press briefing this entire year. But it really is a unique approach to how they engage with journalists.
Just one key point on that: the NSC press team that did not respond to reporters. It wasn't just you. They just don't like the name Alex. But it's that's gone. They're gone now, and now it's the White House press team that is responding on behalf of the NSC. So I sent some normal, request for comment for a story I was writing. Caroline Leavitt responded. It was on record.
Very
So it's very centralized. And look, that's gonna, to your point, I think that's gonna hurt their messaging. There is a specialization in the way that the NSC deals with the press, in the way that they understand the complex foreign policies that are out there. And if you're gonna only do things through a domestic or a political lens, or for the people that are just, their sole goal is really to protect the president, provide the best narrative around him, that's not always going to provide the best information on a complex national security thing, not only to the reporters, but of course, by extension, the main customer of the American people.
There's a reason that John Kirby was brought in after Jen Psaki left. Jen Psaki had done the State Department. She was a foreign policy person. Karine Jean-Pierre, very good at what she did, but also was not a foreign policy person. John Kirby came in to fill that void. A lot of what we do is extremely nuanced, extremely complicated, and you need specialists to handle that, even on the press side.
I want to remind our audience and our virtual audience that if you want to send a question into us, you can do so at cnas.org/live. And I've got my handy iPad here, and I can see if you've got a question or two from the audience as we're continuing our conversation. Let's be a little bit introspective to the media side of things. Obviously, there is a shifting media landscape. We've got different types of mediums represented here today, but there are also, and the administration communicates this, there is both labeling by the administration, and there is a perception, I think it's fair to say publicly, that different media organizations come to their stories with a particular angle or a particular bias, and you can layer on top of that sort of corporate ownership of media and sort of the general conversation about media being fair to one side or being not fair, having a particular angle or bias. Those of us in the national security space often like to place ourselves in the position of we're just doing national security. Like, we are not as interested oftentimes in the partisan politics side. We care about national security issues. So I tend to think that many who are in the national security reporting space also have that worldview, are thinking about things because they are interested in the world events, in the world more broadly, and in national security issues. So how do you, Alex Marquardt, I'll start with you, how do you as a journalist think about your reporting, and how do you deal with the fact that the broader public may have a perception of the news organization that you're working with?
It's very tough, and I think to some extent you kind of have to ignore it. And I very much bristle when people try to lump CNN in with, say, MSNBC, which is unabashedly a left-wing, opinion outlet for the most part, certainly in the evening. I do think we try to hew as closely as we can to our centrist roots. I thank my lucky stars every day that I don't cover the White House and I don't cover politics, and I do get to just focus on Gaza, Ukraine, Iran, for example. I mean, Alex Ward and I spend our days trying to figure out what is the latest step in these talks, who's saying what. I think where the two kind of meet is say, for example, Steve Witkoff is running off to meet with Putin by himself with an interpreter provided by the Kremlin. And most of us who have covered national security are kind of aghast at that, as are Republicans and Democrats who have been doing this kind of thing for some time. And so, when you analyze that or criticize that, is that you don't want that to be a reflection of any kind of political views. They are reshaping the sort of the approach, and that's where things that's kind of the new angle on a lot of this. But I really do think that generally, thankfully, what we do doesn't necessarily change from administration to administration, except for the different approaches of those administrations.
There are policies that work and there are policies that don't. And I mean, with the Biden team, for example, they were like, well, I mean, I was on Blinken's 11th trip to the Middle East to try to get a Gaza deal. At that point, we were like, really? Like, you know, like what are you trying to get out here? He goes, well, you know, you do this and then it's multiple days of failure and then one day of success. But you're allowed to report and say, look, this isn't working. Might it work? Maybe. And they needed the Trump administration at the end just to get there. But we're allowed to call the balls and strikes there to go, okay, what the current policy we're pursuing is not showing any signs of success, and you know, it's not really up to us to say there's an alternatives, but we can talk to people who have alternative ideas. But one quick thing about just the media in general. I mean, it's a human enterprise, right? And as any human enterprise, there are mistakes. The good news, I think what we all do is we go, hey, if there was a mistake, big or small, it's corrected. Do we miss certain big stories? Of course. Do we miss certain small stories? Of course. But overall, we hold ourselves accountable, which is more than can be said for just many other kinds of institutions. And so for that alone, I think, you know, we're still trying to do the best job we can out there. And just very quickly, since I see people with birthdays definitely way after mine, anyone here want to be a reporter? I'm going to assume that sound we're hearing is a bunch of hands up online. But yeah, but like, I don't blame you actually, because it's like tough right now. Not just the job is hard, many jobs are hard. But like, it's a tough environment to be one, and I totally get why you'd want to work on other things. However, if you're thinking about it, please join us. We'd love to have you.
We're winding down our time. Natalie, I'm going to give you a quick word because I know the nonpartisan nature of the work that you guys do is important.
Yeah, it's really crucial to us. I think, again, I mean, you're both absolutely right. It's a really difficult time, and I think, frankly, if you focused all of your editorial decisions on whether the public might perceive you as biased, you wouldn't get any work done. So we have to do the best we can, making very clear that we are representing arguments. We put a lot of effort, Carrie, you know, because you've written for us. We put a lot of effort into making sure that what we publish is a very honest and robust engagement with the issues, so people can write a normative piece, but they will be absolutely required to engage with the best arguments on the opposing side. And we're partially able to do that because we are a nonprofit organization. We don't have the same pressures that the Wall Street Journal or CNN have. It's okay for us if we have a very small audience of people who are going to get all the way through a 3,000-word article, right? For people who are not journalists, that's like 12 pages of double-spaced article. You know, most people are not going to necessarily have the time or energy to read that or listen to our hour-long podcast conversations with an expert that get sometimes very in the weeds. But we try to just do the best we can engaging with ideas, issues, the law. If it turns out that, you know, our analysis of whether something that has happened in an executive order is an overextension of executive authority as designed by the Constitution. Can you perceive that as a legal analysis? Can you perceive that as a partisan attack? I suppose it's in the eye of the beholder, but we feel pretty strongly that it is very much a legal analysis.
You're going to say that. Well, as CNES is a bipartisan organization in terms of our people, and we think of our work as nonpartisan and really just working to develop policy recommendations and ideas for U.S. national security. We could not do it without the work of national security reporters and journalists and analysts. So thank you all. I hope you'll join me in thanking our panel of Alex Marquardt, Alex Ward, and Natalie Orpett.